On November 14, 1942, at 4 o'clock in the morning in the village of Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle in occupied France, an American priest named Nathaniel Brooks opened the side door of his church and handed a handwritten list to an SS officer. On this crumpled piece of paper, traced in black ink by a trembling hand, 412 names, entire families, children, elderly people, all hidden in the cellars, the attics, the confessionals of his own parish. In exchange, he was promised something that many would consider derisory: the preservation of his church, a seat on the puppet city council, and the benevolence of a collaborationist bishop who dreamed of becoming a cardinal under the Third Reich. What you are about to hear in this story is not a legend. It is not a war rumor. It is a secret buried for 50 years in the American military archives, unearthed by chance in 1994, and which poses a question that no one truly dares to confront. Can a betrayal of this magnitude be redeemed by a single act of revenge? And if so, at what price? If you're here because you're looking for stories that don't simplify good and evil, because you want to understand what truly goes on in a man's soul when he chooses to survive by sacrificing innocence, then subscribe now. Because what you're about to discover goes far beyond what official history dares to tell. Let's go back to that November night. Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle was just a dot on the map, a village of 1,000 souls nestled between the Vosges Mountains and the German border. Before the war, it was a place where everyone knew each other, where the church bells marked the rhythm of weddings, baptisms, and funerals. An ordinary place. Peaceful. Forgettable. But in 1940, when the panzers crossed the Meuse and France collapsed in 6 weeks, Saint-Rémy became something else. A refuge. Not by choice, by geography. Far enough from the major cities to escape the initial roundups. Close enough to Switzerland to nurture the hope of escape. And above all, run by a foreign priest, an American, whose nationality offered an illusion of neutrality. Father Nathaniel Brooks arrived in France in 1938, sent by his diocese in Massachusetts to perfect his French and deepen his faith in what he had been told was the spiritual heart of Europe. He was 32 years old, with an angular face and gray eyes that always seemed to be searching for something beyond the horizon. He was pious, sincere, and a little naive, the kind of man who still believed that human kindness could triumph over brutality if one prayed hard enough. When the war broke out, he could have gone home. His embassy had offered him the opportunity. But Nathaniel had refused. He felt responsible for his parishioners. He believed that a man of God should stay where he was needed. And then the refugees started arriving. First, by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Jews fleeing Paris, Lyon, Strasbourg. Entire families with ripped open suitcases. Children who didn't understand why they were being dragged from their beds in the middle of the night. Old people walking barefoot on the frozen roads. They knocked on the church door because they had been told that an American priest could protect them, that the Nazis wouldn't dare touch a citizen of a neutral country. Nathaniel couldn't refuse. Not in front of those faces. Not in front of those mothers who held their babies close as if the embrace could make them invisible. So he hid them. In the crypt. In the attic above the sacristy. In cupboards disguised behind tapestries. He brought them bread stolen from the parish rations, water drawn before dawn, blankets he took from his own bed. He whispered prayers to them in English because it was the only language in which he could still believe God heard him. For 2 years, it worked. Not perfectly. There were alerts, raids, times when German soldiers searched the church while children held their breath in spaces so cramped they couldn't move their arms. But each time, Nathaniel had found the words. He had shown his American passport. He had invoked canon law. He had lied with the assurance of a man who believes he is defending the truth. And then, in the autumn of 1942, everything changed. Bishop Monsignor Edouard Valtier came to visit him. Valtier was a man Nathaniel admired before the war. A brilliant theologian, a charismatic orator, a defender of Catholic tradition against what he called modern decadence. But when the Germans arrived, Valtier saw an opportunity. He understood that the Reich was seeking allies among the French elite, and that a collaborating bishop could obtain considerable privileges, protection of church property, funding for new parishes, and political influence. He dreamed of a cardinalate, perhaps even of Rome one day. But to achieve that, he had to prove his loyalty. That day, in Nathaniel's cramped office, Valtier sat across from the American priest and spoke for an hour. He spoke of order, of discipline, of the need to choose sides. He explained that the war would be long, that Germany would win, and that those who resisted were only prolonging the suffering. Then he asked the question, "How many Jews are you hiding here, my son?" Nathaniel felt his blood run cold. He opened his mouth to deny it, but Valtier raised his hand. "Don't lie. The Germans already know. They're just waiting for the right moment. But I can offer you an alternative." The alternative was simple, cruel, perfectly logical within the cold mechanics of power. If Nathaniel gave the names willingly, if he cooperated, then the church would be spared. The bells would remain untouched. The buildings would not be requisitioned. Better still, Nathaniel would be recognized as a reliable collaborator, which meant access to circles of power, invitations to official meetings, and the ability to influence local decisions. "You could save far more people in the long run," Valtier had murmured, "by being inside the system rather than challenging it." Nathaniel spent 3 days praying, 3 days waking up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, the faces of those children hidden in his crypt imprinted behind his eyelids. 3 days convincing himself that there must be another way, but there weren't any. On the 4th day he wrote the list. 412 names. He knew half of them by their first name. He had baptized some of their children. He had listened to their confessions. He had prayed with them in the darkness of the crypt, promising them that God would not abandon them. And now he was delivering them. On November 14th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the trucks arrived. Nathaniel stood on the church steps, the list folded in his pocket, and watched the soldiers enter. He heard the shouts, the pleas, the doors being ripped from their hinges, the children being dragged from the closets. A woman, Rachel Steinberg, grabbed hold of him as she passed by. She was 40 years old, 3 children, a husband who had already died in Drancy. "Why?" she asked. "Just that. Why?" Nathaniel did not answer. He couldn't. He stood there petrified while 400 people were loaded into trucks like cattle. And when the last vehicle disappeared into the November mist, when silence fell again on Saint-Remy, Nathaniel entered his empty church, knelt before the altar, and understood something that would haunt him until his last breath. He was no longer a pastor. He was an executioner in a cassock. But what no one knew yet was that this betrayal was only the beginning. Because in the weeks that followed, as the trains departed eastward and smoke rose above the camps, Nathaniel Brooks made a decision that would transform this story into something far more complex than a simple chronicle of cowardice. He decided to do everything he could to destroy those who had forced him to become a monster. And for that, he was ready to kill. In the weeks following his deportation, Nathaniel Brooks discovered something few men experience in their lives: the physical weight of guilt. It wasn't a metaphor, it was real. A constant pressure in his chest that made each breath labored, as if his lungs refused to accept the air he no longer deserved. He hardly slept anymore. When he closed his eyes, he saw faces. Not all of them. Only some. The youngest, 7-year-old Sarah Levy, who had asked him 3 days before the roundup if angels spoke French. 4-year-old David Cohen, who fell asleep every night clutching a wooden horse carved by his grandfather. 14-year-old Rebecca Stein, who wanted to become a doctor and spent her days hidden, reading biology books stolen from the public library. Those faces woke him up at 3 in the morning. Every morning, without exception. But what was perhaps worse than the nightmares was the reward. Because Bishop Valtier had kept his word. Overnight, Nathaniel had become an important man. Respected, protected. German officers greeted him in the street. He was invited to official dinners at the Kommandantur. He had a pass that allowed him to move about freely, even after curfew. He could enter and leave the German barracks without being searched. He had received the power that had been promised to him, and he hated it with every fiber of his being. But he understood something essential during his first dinner with the Nazis. He realized they were underestimating him. To them, Father Nathaniel Brooks was nothing more than an opportunistic priest, a foreigner who had chosen the right side to save his own skin and his church. A useful coward. A man who could be manipulated because he had already proven he was willing to do anything to survive. That evening, seated at a table between Sturmbannführer Klaus Weber and the collaborationist Mayor Henri Dulac, Nathaniel smiled politely, raised his glass to the Reich, listened to the crude jokes about the parasites that had finally been cleaned up, and took mental notes. Who was really in charge? Who made the decisions? Who signed the deportation orders? Who organized the convoys? Who boasted of having personally supervised the loading of the wagons? And above all, he observed their habits, their weaknesses, their vanities. Weber, the Sturmbannführer, was a functional alcoholic. He drank from the morning onwards, but remained sober until midnight, at which point he would usually collapse in a corner muttering songs from his native Bavaria. Dulac, the mayor, was a mediocre man obsessed with his own importance. He collected honorary titles and spent his evenings begging the Germans to give him more responsibilities. Captain Ernst Richter, in charge of the logistics of the deportations, was a meticulous bureaucrat who noted everything in numbered notebooks which he kept in the upper left drawer of his desk. And Monsignor Valtier, the bishop who had orchestrated all this, was a man who never dined without blessing the food, who refused to eat meat on Fridays, and who sincerely believed that God had chosen him to guide the church through this period of moral renewal. Nathaniel hated them all. But he smiled, he clinked glasses. He played the part of the grateful priest, because he already had a plan. This plan was born 3 days after the deportation, when Nathaniel returned to the empty crypt of his church. He found objects left behind by those he had betrayed: a rag doll, a prayer shawl, a family photograph wedged between 2 stones. And on a wall, engraved with a nail in the damp stone, was a message in Yiddish which he had later had to have translated by an old bookseller who had escaped the roundup by hiding in the woods. "We thought you were different." Those 6 words broke him, truly broke him, because they contained no hatred, just disappointment, sadness, as if even at the last moment as they were dragged from their hiding place, they still hoped there was an explanation, a noble reason, something that would justify what he was doing to them. But there weren't any. That night, Nathaniel made a decision. He couldn't bring back those 400 people. He couldn't undo his betrayal. But he could destroy the machine that had used him. He could ensure that those who had turned his church into a trap, who had made him an accomplice to genocide, paid the highest possible price. He was going to kill them. All of them. Not in a fit of rage, not in an isolated act of desperate revenge. No. He was going to do it methodically, intelligently, using exactly the power they had given him against themselves. But he needed help. This is where Marie Blanchard comes in. Marie was 38 years old and ran the only bakery still open in Saint-Remy. Officially, she supplied bread to the Germans and collaborators. Unofficially, she was part of a resistance cell that sabotaged telephone lines, distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, and helped escapees reach Switzerland. She despised Nathaniel deeply, viscerally. The day she saw him leaving the Kommandantur laughing with SS officers, she spat on the ground when she passed him. She hadn't spoken to him since the deportation. To her, he was worse than the Nazis, because he had betrayed the trust of the most vulnerable, because he had used God as a cover for his cowardice. So when Nathaniel walked into her bakery one December morning, alone, and whispered, "I need your help to kill them all," Marie initially thought it was a provocation, or a trap. She placed her bread knife on the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked the man she hated straight in the eyes. "Why would I listen to you?" Nathaniel did not try to justify himself. He did not plead. He did not invoke redemption or forgiveness. He simply told the truth. "Because I have access to them. Because they trust me. And because I know exactly how to bring them all together in the same place, at the same time, without arousing the slightest suspicion." Marie studied his face for a long time. She was looking for the lie, the manipulation. but all she saw was a man emptied of his soul, a man who sought neither forgiveness nor glory, just an end. "How?" she asked. "Thanksgiving," Nathaniel replied. "In 3 weeks. I'm going to organize a Thanksgiving dinner at the parish, an American celebration. I'm going to invite Weber, Richter, Dulac, Valtier, and all the important officers. I'll tell them that this is my way of thanking the Reich for its protection, a tradition of my country, a gesture of gratitude. And I'm going to poison the food. Everything. The wine, the bread, the meat, everything." The silence that followed was thick. Marie could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "Are you serious?" "Completely. Do you realize what's going to happen next? The reprisals. They're going to shoot dozens of people, innocent people." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I know. And I'll live with it, just as I already live with the other 400. But at least their deaths will serve some purpose. They will decapitate the local command. They will sow panic. They will prove that even the most zealous collaborators are not safe." Marie thought about it. She knew he was right about one thing. An action of this magnitude would have a considerable impact. Killing a dozen German officers and high-ranking collaborators in a single night was exactly the kind of operation London constantly demanded, but no one dared attempt. "What poison? That's where I need you. Your network needs to have contacts, doctors, pharmacists, someone who can provide something effective but not too quick. I want them to have time to understand what's happening to them." Marie felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't ordinary revenge, this was calculated cruelty, almost sadistic. But she thought of the trains, of the children, of entire families wiped off the face of the earth because a priest had chosen to save stones rather than souls. "I'll see what I can do," she said finally. "But if you betray me, if this is a trap, I'll kill you myself. Slowly." "I know," replied Nathaniel, "and you would be right to do so." The following 3 weeks were a macabre ballet of preparation. Marie contacted a pharmacist in Metz, a man in the network who had access to strychnine stolen from veterinary stocks. The strychnine was perfect, lethal in small doses, causing excruciating convulsions, progressive suffocation, and a terrifying, conscious death. Exactly what Nathaniel wanted. Meanwhile, Nathaniel played his part with chilling perfection. He visited the officers. He talked with them. He spoke to them about Thanksgiving, about that beautiful American tradition of celebrating gratitude and abundance. He insisted that this would be his way of personally thanking all those who had protected his church. Weber loved the idea. So did Richter. Dulac almost cried with joy at being included in such a prestigious event. And Valtier accepted with that paternal anointing that made Nathaniel want to smash his skull against the altar. The menu was meticulously planned. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, red Burgundy wine, blessed bread, and in every dish, in every glass, measured to the milligram by Marie and the pharmacist, strychnine. The night before dinner, Nathaniel did not sleep. He spent the night in the church, sitting on a bench looking at the crucifix above the altar. He prayed, not for forgiveness. He knew he was beyond that. He prayed that it would work, that his last action on this earth would at least have the merit of being useful. Because he had already decided that after dinner, after seeing these men die in convulsions and terror, he would take his own life. That was the plan. Poison the executioners, then join his victims. But as is often the case in history, plans never unfold exactly as expected. On November 25, 1942, Thanksgiving Day, Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle awoke to a leaden sky. The cold was biting, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and turns every breath into a small cloud of steam. The streets were deserted. The inhabitants remained huddled in their homes, terrified of attracting the attention of the German patrols that crisscrossed the village with unusual nervousness. Something was brewing. Everyone sensed it, but no one knew exactly what. In the church sacristy, Nathaniel Brooks was preparing the banquet with the precision of a surgeon. The tables had been arranged in a horseshoe shape in the main nave, covered with white tablecloths borrowed from the wealthiest families in the village. Silver candlesticks, miraculously spared from requisition, cast a golden light on the display of porcelain and cutlery. Everything had to be perfect, not out of respect for his guests, but because perfection lulls suspicion. Marie Blanchard had arrived before dawn with 2 covered baskets. Officially, she was bringing bread and desserts. In reality, she was carrying death in the form of white powder carefully divided into 12 small waxed paper envelopes. She and Nathaniel barely exchanged a word. They didn't need to. Every action had been rehearsed mentally dozens of times. Marie poured the strychnine into the wine jugs while Nathaniel stood guard by the door. Then she mixed it into the cranberry sauce, the melted butter for the potatoes, and the turkey drippings. The quantity was calculated to kill a grown man in 15 to 20 minutes. Not immediately. Nathaniel wanted them to have time to finish their meal, to feel safe, sated, victorious, and then let them understand. "It's done," Marie murmured, taking off her gloves. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, from adrenaline. "Are you sure you want to go all the way?" Nathaniel nodded without looking at her. "And then what? Retaliation?" "I know." "Nathaniel." She placed a hand on his arm, forcing him to look at her. "They're going to shoot people, peasants, children maybe. Do you understand that?" "I understand that I've already sent 400 people to their deaths, that I'm responsible for every child torn from their mother's arms, that I'm the monster these bastards created." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "So yes, I understand, and I'll do it anyway." Marie withdrew her hand. She wanted to hate him. She already hated him. But there was something in that dead look, in that total acceptance of his own damnation, that deeply disturbed her. "You know we won't be able to protect you afterwards. The resistance won't claim responsibility for this action. You'll be alone." "I know. So why don't you leave? After dinner, why don't you just disappear?" Nathaniel smiled for the first time in weeks. A smile without joy, without hope. "Because I don't deserve to survive this." The guests arrived at precisely 7:00 p.m. Sturmbannführer Klaus Weber entered first, accompanied by 3 junior officers. He wore his dress uniform decorated with medals earned on the Eastern Front. He smelled of cologne and alcohol. He shook Nathaniel's hand with a brusque joviality. "Father Brooks, what a wonderful initiative. You know, I've never celebrated this. What do you say, Thanksgiving?" "That's right, Herr Sturmbannführer. A tradition of gratitude. We give thanks for the harvests, for the protection, for stability." Weber laughed, a hearty laugh that echoed through the empty nave. "Stability, ha ha, that's exactly what we bring. Order, discipline. These French don't know how to appreciate what they have now." Captain Ernst Richter arrived shortly after, with his usual obsession for punctuality. He took out a notebook and noted the exact time of his arrival. Nathaniel remarked that even at dinner, this man couldn't help but bureaucratize every moment of his life. Then Henri Dulac, the collaborationist mayor, entered strutting like a rooster. He was wearing a suit that was too tight, probably the only one he still owned, and he was sweating nervously despite the cold. He wanted so badly to be accepted by the Germans that he became pathetic. And finally, Monsignor Edouard Valtier made his entrance. The bishop moved with the ceremonial slowness characteristic of churchmen who believe that God observes their every gesture. He wore his purple cassock, a solid gold crucifix around his neck. He blessed the congregation with a sweeping gesture, then approached Nathaniel with a fatherly smile. "My dear Nathaniel, what a magnificent demonstration of faith and gratitude. You are an example to all the priests of my diocese." Nathaniel bowed his head respectfully. He squeezed Valtier's soft, cold hand, and he thought, "In an hour, you'll be dead." This thought warmed him from within. The guests took their seats, 12 men in all. Weber and his 3 officers, Richter and 2 of his logistics assistants, Dulac and his deputy, Valtier and 2 young priests he was training in the new political reality. and Nathaniel, seated in the place of honor, opposite Weber. Dinner began with a prayer. Valtier stood up, raised his hands to the sky, and thanked God for this period of moral rebirth, where the forces of chaos are finally mastered by divine order. Nathaniel closed his eyes and murmured, "Amen," with the others. But in his head he was reciting the names: Sarah Levy, David Cohen, Rebecca Stein, Rachel Steinberg. He knew about 50 of them by heart. He recited them like a rosary, a litany of the dead. Then the food was served. Marie had brought everything in covered dishes. She arranged them on a side table and then left immediately as planned. Nathaniel served each guest himself. He sliced the turkey into thick pieces. He poured the cranberry sauce. He filled the glasses with red wine. The Germans ate with gusto. Weber devoured his portion in minutes and asked for more. Richter ate methodically, cutting each bite into equal pieces. Dulac spoke too loudly, recounting trivial anecdotes to impress his masters. Valtier ate delicately, wiping his lips after each bite. Nathaniel barely touched his plate. He had prepared a separate portion for himself without poison, but the idea of eating made him nauseous. Halfway through the meal, Weber raised his glass. A toast to our American friend, Father Brooks, who has proven that even a man of God can understand the realities of the modern world. Everyone raised their glass, Nathaniel too. He took a sip of unpoisoned wine and watched the others empty their glasses. It was done. All that was left to do was wait. The first 15 minutes passed normally. The conversations continued. Weber recounted a story of a battle in Russia. Richter discussed the logistics of the upcoming convoys. Valtier explained his plan to reorganize the parishes in the east. Then, at exactly the 17th minute, Richter froze. He clutched his throat, his face contorted. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Just a strangled gurgle. Weber looked at him, intrigued at first, then worried. "Judge, what's going on?" The captain jumped up abruptly, knocking his chair over. His eyes rolled back, his body stiffened like a board. And then he fell backward, convulsing violently, his head hitting the stone floor with a dull thud. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. Everyone stared at Richter writhing on the ground, his mouth open in a silent scream, his limbs twitching with uncontrollable spasms. Then one of the junior officers screamed and collapsed in turn. And then chaos erupted. Weber sprang to his feet, reaching for his weapon, but his legs buckled beneath him. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his eyes bulging. Dulac began to vomit violently, a red liquid mixed with bile. One of the young priests clutched the table, his fingers clawing at the wood, his face contorted in unimaginable pain. Valtier, for his part, remained seated. He looked at Nathaniel with an expression of absolute understanding. He understood immediately. Everything, the betrayal, the poison, the revenge. "You." He couldn't finish his sentence. The convulsions seized him in turn. Nathaniel stood up calmly. He stepped back a few paces, observing the scene with clinical detachment. 12 men were dying in excruciating pain. Some were convulsing, others were vomiting blood. One of the officers had bitten his tongue so hard that it hung out of his mouth, almost severed in two. It lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes of agony, of pure terror, of bodies refusing to die quickly. And Nathaniel remained there, standing, watching. He didn't pray. He didn't cry. He simply observed, etching every detail into his memory. Because he wanted to remember. He wanted to carry this with him wherever he went next. When the last man, Weber, finally stopped moving, his glassy eyes fixed on the church ceiling, Nathaniel did something unexpected. He took off his cassock, folded it carefully, placed it on the altar. Then he put on a civilian coat that Marie had left in the sacristy. He didn't intend to die tonight. Not yet. Because something had changed during those 8 minutes of agony. He had realized that his death would be too easy, too clean, too quick. He deserved to live with that. To bear the weight of his 400 victims and his 12 murders. To spend every remaining day of his life remembering. suffering, atoning without ever finding forgiveness. Death would be a liberation, and he didn't deserve to be liberated. Marie was waiting for him outside in the shadows with 2 members of the resistance. They had prepared an evacuation route to Switzerland. 3 days of walking through the mountains. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done. So let's go. Now." They disappeared into the freezing night, leaving behind a church full of corpses and a village that would soon discover horror. What no one knew was that Richter, in his bureaucratic obsession, had taken detailed notes on everything, including the planned American dinner with Father Brooks. These notes had remained in his office at the Kommandantur, and when the Germans discovered the bodies, it took them only a few hours to figure out who was responsible. The reprisals were immediate and brutal. The following morning, at precisely 6 o'clock, the residents of Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle were awakened by gunfire. Not isolated shots. A continuous, methodical shooting that lasted nearly an hour. German soldiers had invaded the village during the night. They had broken down doors, dragged people from their beds and forced entire families into the main street. Men, women, the elderly, children. No one was spared. Commander Helmut Steiner, urgently dispatched from Metz to take control of the situation, was a different man from Weber. Colder, more calculating. He didn't drink. He didn't shout. He simply carried out orders with chilling efficiency. And the order was clear: 100 civilians for every 12 officers. A standard reprisal ratio in Nazi logic. They selected their victims at random. The baker and his 3 sons. The entire Dupont family, 7 people. Old Martineau, who could no longer walk and whom they shot dead in his bed. Teenagers. Mothers with their babies in their arms. They lined them up against the church wall, the very same one where Nathaniel had poisoned his guest just hours earlier. The white wall was riddled with bullets and splattered with blood. The bodies fell on top of each other, forming a grotesque heap of broken humanity. 100 people. Exactly. Steiner counted them himself. Then he had posters put up all over the village. The American priest Nathaniel Brooks is wanted for the murder of 12 representatives of the Reich and the French administration. Anyone who helps him will be executed along with their entire family. Anyone who provides information leading to his capture will receive a reward of 50,000 francs. But Nathaniel was no longer in France. Marie and her contacts in the resistance had gotten him across the Swiss border in 3 days, as planned. They had taken mountain paths known only to shepherds and smugglers, walking at night, sleeping in abandoned barns, avoiding the German patrols that crisscrossed the region. Nathaniel had hardly spoken during the journey. He walked mechanically, his eyes empty, like a man already dead who continues to move forward by pure inertia. On the 3rd night, as they approached the border, Marie sat next to him near a tiny campfire. "You knew it would happen," she said. "It wasn't a question." Nathaniel nodded. "And you did it anyway." "Yes." "Why? Why sacrifice 100 innocent people to kill 12 guilty ones? Mathematics doesn't work." Nathaniel stared silently at the flames for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because it wasn't a question of mathematics. It was a question of bearing witness. I wanted these men to know, in their final moments, that even the most cowardly collaborator can turn against them. That no one is ever completely broken. That there is always a possibility of resistance even at the cost of one's own soul. And the other 100, those who died this morning, they will pay for my sins, like the 400 before them. I will carry each of them until my death. This is my burden, my punishment." Marie watched him with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You're a monster, Nathaniel. You know that, don't you?" "I know. But you're our monster now, and I don't know if that's better or worse." They crossed the Swiss border just before dawn. The Swiss border guards accepted Nathaniel as a war refugee after checking his American passport. They knew nothing of what he had done. To them, he was simply an American priest fleeing the Nazi occupation. Marie returned to France immediately. She had work to do. People to help. Nazis to fight. Before leaving, she turned to Nathaniel one last time. "Don't die too soon. You need to live long enough to truly understand what you've done." Then she disappeared into the forest, leaving him alone on neutral Swiss soil. Nathaniel Brooks spent the next 3 years in a refugee camp near Geneva. He registered under his real name, Michael Harrington, the one he had used before entering the seminary. He never identified as a priest. He worked as a laborer, a cook, anything that kept him from thinking. But the nights were impossible. The nightmares became so intense that he stopped sleeping altogether. He stayed awake until he was completely exhausted, until his body collapsed against his will. And even then, the faces returned, not just those of the 400 Jews he had betrayed. Now there were also the 12 men he had poisoned, and the 100 civilians shot in reprisal. 512 dead, all on his conscience. He tried to kill himself 3 times. The first time he cut his wrists in the camp toilets. Another refugee found him and alerted the doctors. They stitched him up and put him under observation. The second time he tried to hang himself in his shack. The rope broke. The third time he walked to Lake Geneva, intending to drown himself. He entered the icy water, swam until he lost his footing, then let his body sink. But at the last moment, something inside him resisted. His arms moved, his legs thrashed, his body refused to die. He woke up on the shore, vomited up the lake water, and cried for the first time since the deportation. Because he understood something fundamental. He did not deserve the escape of death. He deserved to live, to bear, to suffer. That was his penance. In 1945, when the war ended, Nathaniel returned to the United States. Not to Boston, where his diocese awaited him with questions. Not to his hometown, where his family wanted to celebrate his return. He went to a place where no one knew him. A Trappist monastery lost in the Montana mountains. St. Benedict's Abbey. A place of silence and prayer, where the monks spoke only once a week. Where each day resembled the previous one. Where time flowed like a slow and icy river. He introduced himself as Michael Harrington, a former war refugee seeking peace. The monks never asked questions. They welcomed him as a gardener. He wasn't a monk, just a lay employee who lived in a small cabin at the entrance to the monastery and tended the vegetable gardens. He spent 30 years in that monastery. 30 years of planting vegetables, trimming hedges, pulling weeds. 30 years of almost total silence, except for the few words necessary for daily work. 30 years of attending Mass from the back of the chapel, never taking communion, never considering himself worthy to approach the altar. The monks thought he was simply a pious man seeking simplicity. They didn't know he was punishing himself. That every day of mundane activity, every hour of repetitive labor, every sleepless night was a calculated expiation. He kept a list, 512 names. Some he knew: Sarah Levy, David Cohen, Rebecca Stein, Rachel Steinberg. Others were just numbers, because he had never met them. But he had counted them all, memorized them all. Every morning before sunrise, he recited all the names. It took him almost 2 hours. Then he went to work in the gardens, his hands in the soil, his back bent as if physical work could somehow lighten the load. But that didn't alleviate anything. In 1975, one of the older monks, Brother Thomas, noticed that Michael was whispering names while he worked. He approached quietly one summer afternoon. "Michael, may I ask, are these names you are reciting prayers?" Michael stopped digging. He planted his shovel in the ground and slowly stood up. His back was creaking. He was 69 years old now, but he looked 80. "They are dead," he replied simply. "Relatives?" "People I killed." Brother Thomas blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "During the war?" "Yes." "Were you a soldier?" Michael shook his head. "I was a priest." The silence that followed was heavy. Brother Thomas didn't know what to say. He placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, then walked back towards the monastery. They never spoke about that conversation again. But something had changed. Michael had spoken the truth aloud for the first time in 30 years. And that truth, even whispered to just one man, had created a crack in the wall he had built around his guilt. In 1994, Michael Harrington was 88 years old. He was dying. Lung cancer was progressing rapidly. Doctors gave him only a few months at most. It was at this time that a young historian named Dr. Emily Carver knocked on the monastery door. She had spent 5 years poring over American military archives, searching for forgotten stories of the Second World War for her doctoral thesis. In a dusty box marked Unsolved Cases, Occupied France, she had found a strange file. An intelligence report dated 1943 refers to a traitorous American priest turned resistance fighter responsible for the poisoning of 12 Nazi officers and French collaborators in Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle. The report mentions a certain Father Nathaniel Brooks, but gives no details of what happened to him afterward. Emily had followed the lead. She had contacted the Boston Diocese, which confirmed that a Nathaniel Brooks had indeed served in France and had been missing since 1942. But they had no further information. Then, by searching through Swiss immigration records, she found a match. An American priest named Michael Harrington had entered Switzerland in November 1942, exactly when Nathaniel Brooks disappeared. She had continued digging. Michael Harrington had returned to the United States in 1945 and had disappeared from all official records. But by questioning former employees of the Geneva refugee camp, she had learned that a man by that name had once mentioned wanting to join a Trappist monastery, as far away from everything as possible. It had taken him 3 years to identify St. Benedict's Abbey in Montana, and now she was there, in front of an emaciated old man who was gardening despite his constant cough. "Mr. Harrington?" Michael looked up. He immediately knew why she was there. After 50 years, someone had finally found her. "Can I help you?" His voice was hoarse, damaged by decades of silence and now by cancer. "My name is Dr. Emily Carver. I am a historian. I am researching a man named Nathaniel Brooks. I think you know him." Michael gave a sad smile. "I know him very well. It was me." Emily Carver had never imagined this moment would come. For 5 years, she had pursued a shadow, a historical ghost whose very existence was questioned by her colleagues. And now, this ghost stood before her, a gaunt old man with trembling hands and eyes that bore the weight of many lifetimes. "You are Nathaniel Brooks," she repeated, as if she needed to hear it a second time to believe it. "I was," Michael replied, putting down his shovel. "A long time ago. Now I'm nothing more than what you see. A man waiting to die." He coughed violently, a deep cough that shook his whole body. Blood appeared at the corner of his lips. He absent-mindedly wiped it away with his sleeve. "You are sick. Lung cancer. Terminal stage. The doctors are giving me 2 months, maybe 3. I think that's generous of them." Emily took a small tape recorder out of her bag. "May I record our conversation? For my research?" Michael stared at the device for a long moment. Then he nodded. Why not? After all this time, perhaps it's time someone really knew what happened. They sat down on a wooden bench in the shade of an apple tree. The monastery was silent around them, disturbed only by the distant chanting of the monks during Vespers. Emily pressed the record button. "Tell me what happened in Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle." Michael closed his eyes. When he opened them again, it was as if he were looking across 50 years of distance, seeing every detail with terrifying clarity. "I betrayed 412 people, Jews who had trusted me, who believed that the church was a sanctuary. I handed them over to the Nazis because an ambitious bishop and German officers promised me that my church would be spared if I cooperated." His voice was flat, factual, as if he were reciting a report. "I wrote their names by hand. I gave them to an SS man named Klaus Weber. And I watched these families being loaded into trucks. Children torn from their mothers' arms, old people dragged through the mud, people crying, begging, not understanding why their priest, their protector, had sold them." Emily listened, fascinated and horrified at the same time. "Why did you agree?" "Because I was weak. Because I was afraid. Because I convinced myself that saving the church was more important than saving lives. Because..." He paused, searching for the right words. Because when you're faced with an impossible choice, most people choose their own survival, and I was no different. But you did not remain a collaborator. You killed 12 men. A bitter smile appeared on Michael's face. You want me to tell you it was heroism? Resistance? It was none of that. It was pure revenge. I wanted them to suffer. I wanted them to know that even the most cowardly traitor could still get to them. He coughed again, more violently this time. Emily waited until he caught his breath. I poisoned them with strychnine, a poison that kills slowly, in excruciating pain. I wanted them to have time to understand, to realize that the dinner they had just shared was their last meal, to die knowing that it was I, the obedient priest, who had condemned them. And the reprisals? The 100 civilians shot? Michael's face hardened. I knew it would happen. The Nazis had a standard ratio: 10 civilians for 1 officer, 12 officers, 120 civilians. They were generous, they only went to 100. You planned this, and you did it anyway? Yes. How can you live with that? Michael looked Emily straight in the eyes for the first time. I don't live with this, Dr. Carver. I survive. It's different. Living involves pleasure, hope, plans for the future. I have none of that. I wake up every morning, I recite 5 and 12 names, I work myself to exhaustion, and I wait for death to finally claim me. This isn't living. It's penance. Emily turned off the tape recorder. She needed a moment to digest what she had just heard. Why did you agree to speak to me? After 50 years of silence, why now? Michael looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the monastery garden. Because I am going to die soon. And because history has the right to know the truth, not the simplified version where I am either a hero of the resistance or a simple traitor. The real truth, that I was both. That I betrayed out of cowardice and killed out of revenge. That I was never guided by noble principles, but by fear, guilt, and rage. He was silent for a moment, then added, and because I want the survivors to know, if there are any left. I want them to know that I have never forgotten, that not a single day has passed without me thinking of them, that I carry their name like a cross that will never leave me. Emily turned the tape recorder back on. There's something I don't understand. After your escape to Switzerland, after your return to the United States, you could have disappeared completely, changed your name permanently, started a normal life again. Why did you lock yourself away in this monastery? Because I don't deserve a normal life. Because every moment of happiness, comfort, and peace would be an insult to those I killed. Do you understand? I can't forgive myself. And I don't want God to forgive me either. I want to carry this through to the end. Do you still believe in God? After all that, Michael laughed, a bitter, joyless laugh. That's an excellent question. I don't know. I pray every day, I attend Mass, I recite the Psalms. But I no longer know if I do it out of faith or habit. Perhaps I pray to a God who does not exist, or perhaps I pray to a God who exists but who abandoned me a long time ago. In either case, it doesn't change what I should do. Emily put down her pen. What do you want people to remember from your story? Michael thought for a long time before answering. I want them to understand that evil is not always obvious, that monsters are not born monsters, that ordinary, pious, well-intentioned men can become executioners when placed in the right circumstances, and that revenge, even against the guilty, never redeems betrayal. He paused, then continued with a new intensity in his voice. I want them to know that I had a choice, always. When Valtier asked me for the names, I could have refused. I could have died with my refugees. That would have been the right thing to do, but I chose to live, to save my own skin. And then when I poisoned those 12 men, I could have done it without condemning 100 civilians to death. I could have fled beforehand, alerted the population, something, but I didn't. Because my revenge was more important than their lives. Her voice broke slightly. I want people to understand that I am not an exceptional case. I am what anyone becomes when they convince themselves that their survival, their dignity, their revenge are worth more than the lives of others. I am the banality of evil, and that is the most terrifying thing." Emily remained silent for a long moment. She was thinking about her thesis, her years of research, all the stories of heroes and traitors she had studied. And she realized that this story was different, more complex, more disturbing. "You never tried to contact the survivors, to apologize?" "How could I? What would I tell them? Sorry I sent your families to their deaths, but look, I killed a few Nazis in return." There are no words for that kind of betrayal, no possible excuses. Silence is the only honest thing I can offer them. The sun had completely set by now. The monastery bells rang for Compline, the last prayer of the day. "I have to go," said Michael, getting up with difficulty. "The monks will wonder where I am. I'll come back tomorrow to continue the interview." "If I'm still alive," Michael replied with a tired smile. "This body is hanging by a thread." Emily returned every day for 2 weeks. Each day Michael told her a little more. The details he had never shared with anyone. The names he had memorized. The faces that haunted him. The precise moments when he had made his fatal choices. He gave her the complete list of 512 names. He had copied it by hand dozens of times over the years, always afraid of forgetting it. He told her how he prepared the poison, how he watched each man die, how he fled to Switzerland, how he tried to kill himself 3 times. And with each session, Emily saw this man grow weaker. His cough became more violent, his pauses to catch his breath longer, his bleeding more frequent. On the 14th day, when Emily arrived, the monks told her that Michael was too weak to go out. He was bedridden in his small hut. She went anyway. Michael lay on a narrow bed, a thin blanket pulled up to his chin. His face was gray and gaunt. His eyes had lost their sparkle. "Dr. Carver," he murmured. "You came." "Of course. I don't think I have much time. There's something I need to tell you. For your story." Emily sat down on a chair near the bed, her tape recorder ready. "Everyone will think I did all this out of guilt, out of remorse, but that's not entirely true." He coughed, spitting blood into a handkerchief. "When I poisoned those men, when I watched them die, for a few minutes I felt something I hadn't felt for months. Power, satisfaction, almost pleasure." He closed his eyes, as if this confession cost him all the strength he had left. "That's the worst part, you understand? Not that I killed, but that during those 8 minutes of agony, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed seeing them suffer. I enjoyed being the one who decided. And that makes me something far worse than a simple traitor." Emily didn't know what to say. She simply reached out and placed her hand on Michael's. "It makes you human," she said softly. "Complicated, broken, but human." Michael opened his eyes and looked at her with something that almost resembled gratitude. "Tell my story, Dr. Carver, but tell it honestly. Not as a moral parable, not as a war lesson, just as it is. The story of a man who made the worst possible choices and spent 50 years trying to understand why. I will do it, I promise you." Michael smiled weakly. "So I did something good finally. One last thing before the end." He closed his eyes. His breathing became shallower. Emily stayed there holding his hand until the monks came to get her for evening mass. Michael Harrington, formerly Nathaniel Brooks, died 3 days later, on August 17, 1994, at 4 o'clock in the morning. He died alone, as he had wished. The monks buried him in their small cemetery under a simple wooden cross with no name on it. But her story was not yet over. Emily Carver spent the next 2 years verifying every detail of Michael's story. She traveled to Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle, now a peaceful village where almost no one remembers what happened there in 1942. She searched German, French, and Swiss archives. She found deportation records, military reports, and contemporary testimonies. Everything matched up. The dates, the names, the circumstances. Nathaniel Brooks's story was true in every horrific detail. But it was while searching for survivors that Emily discovered something Michael had never told her. Something that completely changed the nature of her story. In 1996, she found a woman named Ruth Steinberg living in a modest apartment in Brooklyn. Ruth was 72 years old. She was the daughter of Rachel Steinberg, one of the 412 people deported from the church in Saint-Rémy. When Emily explained why she was there, Ruth turned very pale. "Did you say Nathaniel Brooks?" "Yes. Do you remember him?" Ruth got up and left the room. She returned a few minutes later with a dented metal box. Inside were yellowed letters, photos, and documents. She took out an envelope and handed it to Emily with trembling hands. "Read this." It was a letter dated July 1943, written in French. The handwriting was that of a child. "Dear Ruth, my name is Sophie Durand. I am 9 years old. I live in a village called Annecy. An American gentleman named Michael asked me to write to you to tell you that your mother was thinking of you very much before leaving. He gave me money so that my father could send this letter to you in America. He told me it was very important. Michael seems very sad. He cries a lot at night. I hope you are well. Sophie." Emily reread the letter 3 times, not understanding it. "I don't know what it means," she admitted. Ruth brought out more letters. Dozens of them, all written by different children, from different places in France, Switzerland, and then the United States, all between 1943 and 1950, all conveying little messages, memories, the last words of people deported from Saint-Rémy. "I received 47 in total," Ruth explained, "over 7 years. Each time it was a child writing on behalf of a man they called Michael, or sometimes the sad man. He gave them money, asked them to write a few lines, and to post the letter." Emily felt her heart beat faster. "Do you know who that man was?" "For years, no. But when you said Nathaniel Brooks, I understood. It was him. He was looking for survivors. He was sending them messages. Not directly, because he was too ashamed, I suppose. But through these children." Ruth took out another envelope, a more recent one. "And then in 1994 I received this, directly. Not written by a child, written by him." Emily opened the envelope with trembling hands. It was a 3-page letter written in Michael's handwriting dated 2 weeks before his death. "Dear Ruth, I don't deserve for you to read these words. I don't deserve your attention, much less your forgiveness, but I am dying. And there are things you need to know before I disappear. I betrayed your mother. I betrayed your entire family. I handed over 412 people to the Nazis because I was weak, because I was afraid, because I placed stones over souls. There is no excuse for this. No justification. It is the worst crime a man can commit. But what you may not know is that your mother survived, not for long, but long enough to write something. In 1943, I contacted a member of the resistance who worked near the Drancy camp. I asked him to find any information on the people I had betrayed. He told me that most had already left for the east for the death camps, but a few were still in Drancy, awaiting deportation. Your mother was one of them. I paid this resistance fighter to send her some paper and a pencil so she could write a final message if she wished. He brought me what she had written 3 weeks later. I'm enclosing her letter with this one. I kept it for 51 years. I read it every night. It was my daily punishment. But now that I'm going to die, it belongs to you. It should always have belonged to you. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I simply want you to know that not a single day has gone by without me thinking of your mother, of you, of everyone I betrayed. I've borne your names like a cross. It changes nothing. It makes no difference, but it's all I could do. Michael Harrington, Nathaniel Brooks. Emily put down the letter and looked at Ruth, tears in her eyes. Your mother's letter. Do you have it? Ruth nodded and handed him a piece of yellowed paper, almost transparent from being folded and unfolded so many times. The handwriting was shaky, difficult to decipher, but the words were clear. My darling Ruth, if you're reading this, it means I won't be coming back. I want you to know that I've never forgotten you, that every day in that camp I thought of your smile, your voice, the way you laughed when I tickled you. I want you to live, my darling. To have children. To be happy. Don't waste your life crying for me. Live for both of us. As for the priest who betrayed us, don't hate him too much. I saw him in the church that day. I saw his face. He was already dead inside. He was carrying his punishment before we even carried ours. I love you forever. Mama. Emily could no longer hold back her tears. She was crying for Rachel, for Ruth, for Michael, for all those lives shattered by war and impossible choices. How do you feel about him? She finally asked. Ruth looked out the window towards the buildings of Brooklyn. For 50 years I hated this man. I hated him with every fiber of my being. I dreamed of finding him, confronting him, spitting in his face. And then I received his letter, and I read my mother's words. And I understood something. She turned to Emily. He punished himself more harshly than I could ever have punished him. He lived in a self-inflicted hell for 50 years. My hatred never hurt him, but his own guilt destroyed him from the inside. Does that redeem what he did? No. Never. But does it simply make him a monster? I don't know anymore. Emily published her thesis in 1997. It was later published as a book in 1998 titled The Priest Who Betrayed His Parish, The True Story of Nathaniel Brooks. The book sparked intense debate. Some accused Emily of glorifying a traitor. Others praised her for presenting the moral complexities of war without oversimplification. Descendants of other victims of Saint-Rémy contacted Emily. Some expressed their anger that this story was being told. Others thanked Emily for preserving the memory of their families. In 2000, a small memorial was erected in Saint-Rémy-sur-Moselle. It bears the 412 names of the deportees, and below it, a smaller plaque with a disturbing inscription. Also, who died that day: 12 collaborators poisoned in reprisal, 100 civilians shot in reprisal, and a priest who lost his soul. Let us remember them all, not to glorify or condemn, but to understand the true price of survival, cowardice, and revenge. The inscription remains controversial. Every year, someone tries to have it removed. And every year, the town hall refuses, arguing that erasing this complexity would be a betrayal of history itself. Ruth Steinberg died in 2003 at the age of 79. In her will, she bequeathed all of Michael's letters to a Holocaust museum. She also left a personal note that was read at her funeral. I spent my life hating a man for what he took from me, and then I realized that the hatred consumed me even more. I don't forgive Nathaniel Brooks, but I understand now that some acts are too complex to be simply judged. They must be borne by the victims, by the perpetrators, by all those who survive. And perhaps that ultimately is the true lesson of history. We all carry something. The question is not whether we are good or bad. It is what we do with that burden. Today, if you visit St. Benedict's Abbey in Montana, you'll find a small, unmarked grave near the garden. The monks never added a plaque. But sometimes, visitors leave stones there, a Jewish tradition to honor the dead. No one knows who left them there. Perhaps descendants, perhaps historians, perhaps simply people who have read history and understood that there is no simple answer to this question. Can one redeem treason through an act of revenge? Michael never believed it. Until his last breath, he considered himself a monster. But perhaps the real monster wasn't the man, but the system that transforms pastors into executioners, that forces impossible choices, that measures human life in ratios of reprisal. And if you're wondering what you would have done in his place, think carefully before answering. Because history teaches us a brutal and undeniable truth. We are all capable of the worst when circumstances push us to it. And acknowledging this truth, however uncomfortable it may be, is perhaps the only safeguard against the repetition of such horrors. What would you do if it were you? If you were forced to choose between innocent lives and your own survival? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to discover other stories that official history prefers to forget. Stories that remind us that the line between good and evil is never as clear as we'd like to believe.